The early morning sun cast a delicate golden light over the sprawling gardens of the Ashcombe estate, its rays filtering through ancient oaks and delicate trimmed box hedges. Dew still clung to the petals of riotous roses, each bloom a whispered promise of the season's gaieties to come. It was here, among the ivy-clad trellises and the delicate lattice-work of wrought-iron benches, that Imogen found herself stepping with quiet resolve beneath the wary eyes of Madame Lettice. The chaperone's sharp gaze never wavered, her posture as rigid as the steel frame of the antique parasol she held, always poised, always alert. The garden, usually a sanctuary of genteel respite and idle flirtations, hummed today with an unusual tension. The arrival of a widow at the rival's domain was material ripe for gossip. Imogen's heels clicked softly on the crushed gravel path, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the low murmur of ladies in silk gowns and gentlemen in finely tailored coats who lingered scattered among the flower beds and marble statuary. Despite the swells of whispered anticipation, Imogen moved with a quiet dignity that suggested a woman secure in herself, despite the tender ache that still clung beneath her measured breath. Her chestnut hair was pinned with intricate precision, each curl seemingly unwilling to betray her composure, framing her face like a delicate Renaissance painting. The scar on her left hand, barely discernible in the soft morning light, fluttered with every gentle touch of her gloves, a silent testament to a past she guarded as closely as the remnants of her late husband's name. Madame Lettice's voice broke through the rustling of silks and the sweet scent of jasmine. "Mrs. Harcourt, pray do remember your steps. One must not invite the gossip to settle beneath one's own feet." Her tone bore the clipped sharpness of a woman used to wielding social regulations as a weapon. Imogen inclined her head slightly, an elegant acknowledgment, though her eyes remained distant, not quite surrendering to the watchful crowd. "It is not gossip, I fear, madam, but the enmity that lurks behind every whispered word," Imogen said quietly, her voice a soft murmur yet somehow carrying the weight of steel beneath its surface. Madame Lettice replied, scanning the garden's edges with a faint narrowing of her eyes. It was at that precise moment that the Earl appeared. A shadow among the flowering shrubs, he watched with a heightening interest as Imogen moved with a restrained grace, avoiding the usual calls of ladies and gentlemen alike. His grey eyes, sharp and penetrating, missed little, the subtle tightening of her lips, the way her posture remained correctly elegant, but impervious to the usual provocations of the season. The crease of discontent etched faintly on his brow deepened as he recognized not just the widow herself, but the layered defiance in her refusal to mingle. The Earl's gaze lingered, drawn inexplicably toward the figure who carried herself with such quiet assurance amidst a sea of expectant rivals and acquaintances. His own family's estate lay merely a carriage's ride away, yet here she was, intruding upon their domain with the silent dignity of one who had no need to prove her worth. The draw of her independence, her refusal to play the usual game of smiles and suitors, ignited an unspoken challenge in his heart, arousing both irritation and curiosity. From afar, Imogen sensed the weight of those grey eyes upon her. It was as if the very ground beneath her conspired with his gaze to mark her presence as a deliberate trespass, yet she did not flinch. The rivalry between their families was as old and tangled as the garden's ancient yew, but beneath the shroud of expectation and protocol, a most delicate and dangerous kind of fascination began to thread silently between them. "Harcourt," Madame Lettice whispered with a tight smile, the edges twitching with barely concealed concern. "The Earl's presence here is no mere coincidence. He watches as a hawk watches its prey." You must not let him unsettle you." Imogen's eyes flicked briefly to Madame Lettice, a faint, wry smile curving her lips. "Let him watch, madam. I will not be so easily unmade." The sun climbed higher, spilling honeyed light over the garden path, but the charged stillness between the widow and the Earl settled like a thread of smoke curling lazily yet inexorably around their figures. A silent promise of encounters to come. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisks, asterisks. The opulent grandeur of Almack's ball that evening was a world apart from the quiet tension of the garden. The glittering chandeliers cast prismatic light over waves of gowns, every silken fold and gleam of jewels a testament to the season's fervour and the merciless dance of society's expectations. The air was rich with the scent of orange blossom and the hushed murmurs of whispered skeins, punctuated by the sharp scrape of violins and the measured steps of dancers gliding across polished floors. Imogen entered under the vigilant escort of Madame Lettice, each step measured, each breath held with a delicate restraint, born of both habit and necessity. The house was alive with the season's buzz voices, dipped in a mixture of admiration and suspicion, glances exchanged like secret messages across the throng. To appear unaccompanied by family brought a curiosity equaling scandal. To stand apart from the relentless tide of suitors was an act of quiet rebellion. "Remember, Mrs. Harcourt," Madame Lettice intoned with strict finality, fingertips resting lightly on the small of Imogen's back, "you must abide by proprieties, engage only where necessary, and, above all, avoid the reckless appearance of inviting undue attention. A widow's independence is tolerated on fragile terms." Imogen's lips pressed into a firm line. Beneath her gown's fine muslin, her heart beat with a stubborn flame she refused to extinguish. She had no intention of succumbing to the pitying whispers or the hollow courtesies of those who equated widowhood with diminished worth. The Earl arrived with his usual brusque command of the room. His broad shoulders cut a formidable silhouette against the flickering candlelight, his dark chestnut hair perfectly swept away from his narrowing brow. His presence drew whispered greetings and subtle bows, the social tides parting instinctively before him as he made his way through the crowd with the assurance of a man accustomed to dominion, and then his eyes found her. Imogen caught the moment sharp, knowing as if he sought to measure her very soul beneath the layers of silks and society's pretense. There was no warmth in his gaze, but a raw, unsettling intrigue that flickered like embers beneath winter's ice. He advanced a few steps closer, lips curving in a half-smile that held both challenge and reluctant admiration. The usual suitors, polished young men eager for her attention, faltered at her refusal to engage. Where other ladies greeted each hopeful with practised laughter and fluttering fans, Imogen's silence became an unspoken barrier, an invitation to reconsider the rules. They lingered, uneasy and muted, as she answered nothing but polite nods or distant smiles, her hazel eyes ever watchful, ever guarded. The Earl came to stand near enough to speak, his voice low but carrying a crisp authority. "Harcourt, one might think you seek to avoid the very dance of the season." She met his grey gaze with steady calm, the faintest quirk of her brow rebuking the insinuation. "The dance is often less tempting than the music beneath it, my lord," he chuckled softly, a sound that was equal parts amused and genuine, a clever reply. "I had hoped the season might loosen your tongue, and perhaps your heart." Imogen's glance flickered, just for a fraction of a heartbeat, revealing a shadowed vulnerability, before tightening once more. "Some hearts are best left unburdened, my lord," she replied evenly, "at least until they choose their own company." Their exchange, brief yet electric, sent ripples through the nearby whisperers. Madame Lettice's fingers tightened on her fan, a silent warning veiled in a thin smile, but Imogen met her protector's eyes with a quiet defiance that needed no word. The Earl's expression darkened marginally, a crease deepening as he weighed the challenge before him, this widow who refused to bow to the conventions as eagerly as she refused to submit to the ghosts of her past. Across the room, under the rippling glimmers of crystal and candlelight, the rivalry between their families seemed a trivial backdrop to a more profound contest, that of two guarded souls drawn reluctantly together by the very restraints that sought to keep them apart. And so the dance began, not one of steps or measured turns, but a slow, simmering game of restraint and revelation, where every glance, every guarded word might yet unravel the careful facades they both wore. In that moment, amid whispered gossip and the shifting shadows of the season, nothing was certain except the undeniable spark that flashed in the eyes of both the widow and the Earl. The morning that followed bore no hint of the illicit energy simmering from the night before, save for the missive that arrived just as the first blush of dawn brushed the windows of Imogen's modest drawing-room. The note was discreetly placed upon her mahogany writing desk, a single sheet of cream paper, heavy with the faint scent of sandalwood and something less definable, yet unmistakably belonging to the Earl. The handwriting was deliberate, the ink a sober black, curling with an elegance that bespoke restraint and intent. "Lady Imogen," it began, "I would be honoured if you would permit me the pleasure of your company at Greystone Hall this coming Friday afternoon. It is, I confess, an unconventional request for a widow in our shared sphere, yet I trust the garden's quietude will grant us some respite from the suffocating clamour of society. Pray, consider this an earnest invitation from one who finds the week's engagements far less bearable than your own presence might make them." The note was unsigned, save for a simple flourish beneath the closing line. The quiet sound of quill-stroked ink somehow sparking an unexpected thrill deep within her heart, too long tempered by grief and obligation. Madame Lettice's sharp voice filtered through the doorway, not yet aware of the letter's arrival. Imogen hid the note within the folds of the delicate lace handkerchief resting by her side, before summoning the older woman with a soft "Madame Lettice." The chaperone entered, her eyes immediately catching the barely concealed excitement in Imogen's expression. "You seem distracted this morning, my lady. Have I missed a summons, or some pressing matter of business?" "Only a matter of interest," Imogen replied, inclining her head toward the sealed envelope still within her handkerchief. "A message arrived from the Earl." Madame Lettice's eyebrows knit together with a subtle frown. "A letter from him. Imogen, surely you understand the consequences such an association might invite. The season is replete with whispers sharp enough to poison reputations. The Earl's invitation, if accepted, would spark no small scandal. That house has long been a rival, and society's eyes are hungry for any excuse to malign a widow's name, especially one as recently liberated from her late husband's shadow as yourself." Imogen's jaw tightened with a stubborn tilt. "I am neither a child to be cloistered, nor a prize to be paraded. If scandal arrives, it will find me standing, not shrinking. The season's hostesses will have their tongues, no doubt, but I refuse to let their petty fears dictate my actions." Madame Lettice sighed, the air about her tightening with a blend of concern and reluctant admiration. "You possess a courage most would envy, my lady, yet do tread with care. The Earl, for all his charm, is a man bound by chains, not easily seen. His demeanour conceals much. As you well know, your visit will be noted, murmured over tea-tables in many drawing-rooms. Pray, do not give cause for further injury to yourself. Loose tongues are like nettles," Imogen said softly, fingers pressing the note to her breast. They sting only as long as one allows them to be felt, and so it was decided. Friday's afternoon dawned clear and bright, the sun casting dappled patterns through the vast greening of Greystone Hall's ancient oaks and manicured formal gardens. Imogen arrived precisely at the hour appointed, herself an image of calm composure, despite the ripple of nerves that fluttered like restless birds beneath her ribcage. Her travels to the estate were intentionally solitary, a carriage from her own household, accompanied only by Madame Lettice, who regarded the environment with watchful eyes. The grandeur of the estate was undeniable, but what caught Imogen's attention was the muted sense of tension beneath its polished veneer. She was led to the garden's edge, where the Earl, dark eyes alight, with a rare flicker of something soft awaited beneath the boughs of a sprawling oak whose leaves whispered with the breeze. He bowed with an ease that was almost rehearsed, but the curl of his lips betrayed a trace of something more genuine, a flicker of welcome not ordinarily offered in public or private to a woman of her standing. Your presence here lends even these ancient branches a new grace. Imogen turned her eyes from the stately facade of the house to meet his gaze, a spark of defiance embedded within her customary reserve. "Lord E," she began, then corrected herself with a faint smile. "You will forgive my informality. I think all formalities outweigh the garden's liberty." His eyes flickered, a glance sharper now, curious. "Indeed? Yet even gardens have their boundaries, their guardrails." "I am not unaware of boundaries," she replied quietly, "nor do I mistake their intention. Yet some boundaries exist only because we fear what lies beyond them." They began to walk, their steps falling into the soft mulch of winding paths, the air heavy with the scent of lilac and freshly turned earth. The Earl's expression darkened subtly, as if wrestling with a thought best unspoken. "You speak as though you believe freedom is merely beyond contrived barriers," he said cautiously, "and yet society demands duty. We owe ourselves to reputation, to family, to the silence of those who came before us." Imogen tilted her head, the sunlight catching the faint scar on her left hand, a mark she bore with quiet pride, a sign that freedom paid with pain was not freedom undone. "But I believe them more akin to dance partners, sometimes erratic but necessary for balance. To embrace one without the other leaves a hollow rhythm." A rare smile crept across the Earl's face, fleeting and brittle. "And yet you choose to lead without invitation, stepping boldly where few dare tread. Perhaps I am tired of waiting for the dance cards to be filled with others' names," she murmured, eyes meeting his squarely. He stopped beneath the generous shade of a sprawling oak, the dappled light flickering across his brow. "Imogen, you surprise me more than you know. Beneath your composure lies a tempest of thoughts I am only beginning to understand." Her gaze softened, the vulnerability she kept so guarded threading through her words. "And beneath your arrogance I sense a man wrestling with shadows too deep to name." The air between them shifted, charged with a brittle anticipation, as if the very trees leaned in to hear. The Earl's shoulders sagged for a moment, the facade faltering as he allowed himself a quiet admission. "The burden of title, of expectation. Sometimes I envy those without such chains. Freedom, it is a fragile thing." "Fragile, yes," Imogen whispered, "but not impossible. Nor is it reserved for those born with the loudest names or the thickest coffers." Her hand twitched unconsciously, as if wanting to reach between them, but restrained by decorum and caution. They resumed their walk, the conversation shedding its earlier formality, evolving into something more intimate. "What is it that you truly desire, Imogen?" the Earl asked, his voice lowered to a near confession. "Not the veneer your society demands?" Her eyes reflecting the deep green of the ancient oaks under which they stood. I desire to be seen, not as a widow, not as a rival, but simply as Imogen. A woman capable of mistakes, hopes, and even happiness. He studied her profile, the fine lines of determination softened by vulnerability, and if happiness demands sacrifice, if it risks scandal, then I shall bear those consequences as I would bear any wound, she said quietly, with courage, dignity, and without regret. The Earl's expression slackened, the brittle armour slipping, as he met her gaze, with something nearly like trust. My family and all of London would surely warn me away. Then perhaps, for once, we might risk ignoring them, she whispered, heart quickening. Beneath the timeless sky, amidst the whispers of ancient trees and the hushed songs of hidden birds, two rival souls found a fleeting sanctuary. Neither spoke of the future, nor the dangers that surely awaited, but in that shared moment of defiance and tentative connection, the boundaries of duty and desire grew ever thinner. As shadows lengthened and the light softened, Imogen and the Earl parted ways with hands barely brushing, a contact electric enough to promise that this garden, this stolen afternoon, was but the first dance of many yet to come. Whispers clipped through drawing rooms like shards of broken glass, each sharp and cold enough to pierce any fragile hope. Lady Imogen, wrapped in silk, as fine as frost, and laden with pearls that caught the candlelight but failed to ward off the chill of society's gaze, moved through the throng with practiced grace. Each murmur seemed aimed like an arrow, and though she bore no outward sign of distress, within her chest a slow, insistent ache pulsed a mixture of defiance, longing, and an unbearable loneliness. There goes the widow, fool enough to entertain the company of that dreadful Earl. Lady Wendover's voice floated from a distant salon. Frosted with condescension and barely disguised venom, Imogen did not flinch. She heard the words clearly, as she did countless variations each day, insinuations that she was seeking to reclaim youth or station through a marriage neither society nor her own heart would sanction. The rumours swirled like a gathering storm. The Earl, it was said, intended to propose a marriage of convenience, not the fairy tale alliance the ton dared to dream of, but a pragmatic union designed to consolidate estates and avoid scandal. A marriage of convenience. The phrase haunted her like a spectre. To others, it was a simple transaction. To her, it was the dull chant of compromise, a betrayal of the very vows she had taken at St. Michael's Church on a morning of bitter tears and final goodbyes to a love forever lost. She had sworn, with trembling hands and a heart bruised to bleeding, never to marry again, never to expose herself to the peril, the humiliation, the quiet death of the self beneath the mantle of a husband's name. Yet, watching the Earl from across crowded rooms, a man whose brooding eyes seemed to carry the weight of unspoken sorrows, Imogen found herself questioning the ironclad lines she had drawn around her life. The pull toward him was unexpected, a subtle gravity at odds with the carefully constructed walls of her resolve. He was a man of flaws and contradictions, bearing scars deeper than any she could see, and in the sanctuary of shared glances they had traded silent promises neither voice nor society dared sanction. She felt the heat rise in her cheeks as another whisper slid like silk and thorns across the floor. To consort with such a character, her judgment, or desperation, must be quite clouded. Madame Lettice appeared at her side, the sharp blue of her eyes flickering as she guided Imogen gently toward a sequestered alcove. "You heard, no doubt," she murmured, her tone low enough only for Imogen's ears. "The ton is in uproar at the notion. They say it would besmirch your family, your reputation, and his. A dangerous liaison, my lady." Imogen's gaze dropped, fingers unconsciously tracing the subtle scar along her left hand. The physical reminder of past pain steadied her, gave her strength. "Let them talk," she said with quiet dignity, voice low but resolute. "I have no desire to defend myself against the shallow judgments of those who do not see the whole. What is whispered behind closed doors need never reach the lips of those who matter." Madame's expression softened, but the wariness lingered. "You are fortunate. Your restraint is such a shield. Yet I advise caution always. The Earl," she hesitated, recasting her words carefully, "is not a man accustomed to gentle dealing in matters of the heart." The caution was needless. Imogen was no stranger to the dangers of fragile affections in a society that demanded rigid decorum. Yet beneath that armor of learned stoicism, an ember glowed fiercely, an ember stoked by the memory of their afternoon beneath the ancient oaks, by the brief freedom of vulnerability shared in stolen moments. It promised a warmth she had believed forever beyond her reach. As the evening deepened and the light dimmed, Imogen found herself walking the expansive halls of her family estate alone, footsteps soft against the polished wood, silence pressing around her like a velvet shroud. With each breath she questioned how a woman vowed never to remarry could feel her heart stir so dangerously at the thought of one flawed man. Was it hope, madness, or the faintest whisper of a future she had forbidden herself to imagine? Across town, in a richly appointed library, fragrant with leather and the sharp tang of old tomes, the Earl sat heavily in a carved oak chair, the flicker of a fire casting dancing shadows against the walls. His gaze was fixed on the worn pages of a ledger, but his mind was far from the arithmetic of land and titles. Instead, it was prey to a different kind of reckoning, the perilous, perplexing import of recent days, and the woman who seemed to unsettle his carefully maintained defences. His closest confidant, Sir Edmund Langley, a man whose years of service had granted him the keenest insight into the Earl's secret heart, arrived without announcement. Edmund's expression was grave, edged with the bittersweet burden of loyalty and concern. "My lord," he began, voice measured but firm, "I come bearing concerns not easily set aside." The Earl closed the ledger with a sigh, his hand lingering on the cover as if reluctant to break the fragile silence. "I rather suspect whatever it is has been weighing upon you long enough." Edmund took a seat opposite, hands folded beneath his waistcoat. "It is about Lady Imogen, your growing public attachment. The ton is alight with speculation. Some believe it a tactical alliance, others whisper of scandal waiting in the wings." The Earl's brows knit together in frustration and self-reproach. "I am well aware, yet it is more than political expedience that draws me. She is unlike any other, strong, unyielding, fiercely honest, and yet there lies beneath her carriage a vulnerability I cannot easily set aside." Edmund nodded thoughtfully. "I understand your feelings more than you might believe. But this woman's reputation is complicated, as you surely know. Widowhood grants society a measure of sympathy, but it also invites cruel scrutiny. To attach yourself to her so openly invites not merely gossip, but the risk of irreparable harm to your standing and possibly to your very title." The Earl ran a hand through his dark chestnut hair, the weight of expectation pressing like a vice. "I have felt the sting of my own flaws, anger, impulsiveness, a temper too quick to flare. I question whether I possess the steadiness to nourish what grows between us." Edmund's voice softened, a rare vulnerability in his normally composed tone. "No man is flawless, but restraint can be learned if the heart is willing. What troubles me is the risk of haste, driven by loneliness or defiance, rather than genuine understanding." The Earl's eyes darkened with a flicker of pain, the faint crease on his brow deepening. I have spent years battling the ghosts of my past father's expectations, my own restless spirit. To build a future with her requires more than desire. It demands courage, patience, and perhaps breaking every rule society has ever etched in stone. And that, Edmund said gently, may be your greatest challenge yet. Silence settled between them, heavy with the uncertain promise of what might come. The Earl looked toward the window, where moonlight spilled silver upon dew-laden gardens, a scene not unlike the clandestine afternoon with Imogen, a memory that sprang both warmth and unease. For now, he muttered, all I can do is watch her close. But to something better. The days that followed were a delicate dance of appearances and silences. Imogen kept her composure as society's tongue wagged ceaselessly, while the Earl wrestled with the unseen forces that sought to keep them apart. Both bore the weight of their reputations like chains. Yet in moments stolen beneath the sun and stars, they found the fragile, stubborn bloom of connection, one worth every whispered caution and every guarded glance. Imogen, in her solitude, touched the scar on her hand, as though drawing strength from it, a talisman against doubt. That pale mark, a silent testament to pain endured and courage summoned, seemed to promise that no matter the verdict cast by the world, she would stand firm. The Earl, by contrast, wrestled with his reflections in a gilded mirror, the handsome face shadowed by uncertainty. He knew well that the road ahead was littered with peril, both personal and public, and that even the smallest misstep could wreck the fragile bond forming between them. Yet, beneath the weight of expectation and whispering salons, beneath the judgment and the threat of loneliness, a singular truth anchored them, the undeniable magnetic pull between two lost souls, daring for the first time to imagine a future unshackled by fear. And so the season drifted on, two rival hearts circling ever closer beneath the watchful eyes of London's unforgiving society, each step a defiant brushstroke upon a canvas still awaiting revelation. The morning sun cast a pale gold through the tall windows of Lady Imogen's modest drawing-room, its light falling softly across the neat stacks of embroidery silks and unopened letters that cluttered the small writing table. Madame Lettice, ever the vigilant chaperone, sat poised with a stiff-backed dignity that bordered on austerity, her sharp blue eyes fixed intently on Imogen's slender figure as she rose from the settee. The room, steeped in the gentle scent of lavender and old paper, seemed charged with an energy that the usually serene woman could neither ignore nor entirely comprehend. Imogen's chestnut hair, carefully arranged in its usual intricate Regency coil, caught the sunlight and flickered with tones of amber and mahogany as she paced with slow confidence. Her deep hazel eyes, usually mirroring the placid calm she cultivated for the world, gleamed now with something resolute, almost fierce. There was a flicker of that scar on her left hand as she clasped it in a sudden tightening of her slender fingers, drawing upon its silent testament to endurance. Madame Lettice, Imogen began, her voice measured but unmistakably sharp in its determination. I have made my decision. I shall attend the coming ball without your accompaniment. Madame Lettice's well-formed brow rose in astonishment. Without a chaperone, Miss Imogen? Such a thing! Her tone lifted in a mixture of concern and surprise, even dismay. In this season, in London? You understand the perils, the ravages of scandal, and the inescapable watchfulness of society's gaze. Imogen halted mid-step and turned fully to face her, the quiet power in her gaze settling like a stone in the air between them. I will not be a silent shadow, a mere cautious footnote, relegated to whispers behind fans. I will stand sovereign in my own right, not as a widow housed behind propriety, but as a woman with agency, with claims to respect beyond that of Guardian's approval. Madame Lettice's eyes sharpened, the faint lines around them tightening, as she considered this new audacity. "Of course, I understand your wishes, but you must see how precarious such a stance is. The season is no place for rebellion, especially for a widow whose name already dances on the whispering tongues of the ton." The widow smiled, a thin, enigmatic curl of the lips that did not quite reach the seriousness in her eyes. "Nor will they. It is high time I shaped the tale rather than be moulded by it." There was a long silence, only the ticking of the mahogany clock broken between the threads of their impassioned exchange. Madame Lettice drew a slow breath, her sharp gaze never leaving Imogen's. "Then you do this knowing full well the price. You understand the risks of exposure, of igniting the fire that may consume your reputation." Imogen held the older woman's look unflinchingly. Better to burn briefly in truth than live endlessly in a shadowed half-life. "I have given enough to fears and shoulds and shall nots. I seek more than safety, I seek dignity. That I shall have, with or without your blessing." Madame Lettice's lips thinned and pressed together in a line of reluctant acceptance. She inclined her head slowly. "Very well, I shall not hinder you. Yet mark my words, Miss Imogen, the path ahead is fraught with eye and tongue alike. You have made your choice." Imogen's breath came in steady waves, her heart beating a little faster, but not with fear. "And so has this widow." When evening descended with its muted velvet darkness, London's grandest house on Grosvenor Square was ablaze with light and life. The air was thick with jasmine and the scent of polished wood, mingling with the sharp sweetness of champagne and the heavier musk of finely ground powder. Servants in dark uniforms flitted like shadows behind crimson curtains and polished silver. The murmuring of the ton was everywhere, a tide of anticipation, gossip, and the thrilling palpability of rivalries resurfacing fresh and fierce. Imogen stepped through the sprawling doorway, her midnight blue gown, fashioned in the latest style but uncompromisingly modest, with the delicate sheen of silk cinched elegantly at her waist. The gentle sweep of her silhouette caught the light with subtle movement, yet it was the set of her shoulders, the steady burn in her hazel eyes, that truly commanded notice. A collective breath seemed to hush the ballroom, as eyes turned some wide in surprise, others narrowing in consideration, drawn by the striking image of a widow who dared appear unshielded by a single protector. For a moment, Imogen felt the weight of those gazes like a physical warmth or chill upon her skin, but instead of faltering, she held herself straighter, keeping her gaze poised and direct. She was not merely a tale to be told, or a curiosity to be gawked at. She was a woman reclaiming her place within this delicate dance of society, refusing to play the cautious, silent part any longer. From across the room the Earl's grey eyes found her immediately. The crease of discontent in his brow softened imperceptibly as he watched her move with quiet command through the throng. He noted the subtle strengthening in the line of her jaw, the defiantly graceful tilt of her head. It was a declaration in itself, impossible to ignore. Against the backdrop of murmured questions and doubting glances, she was a singular allure, an enigma wrapped in elegance. The Earl made his way toward her, with the easy certainty of a man who had long made his peace with his desires, even if he kept them carefully guarded. Whispers rustled like silk behind his back, the half-spoken speculation mingling with sharp gasps of surprise as he reached Imogen's side. When he spoke, his voice was soft but low enough for those nearest to catch the nuance of unexpected meaning. "May I have this dance?" The simple question silenced much of the room's undercurrent of speculation as eyes flickered from the pair, astonishment mingling with curiosity. The kind of alliance implied on the ballroom floor between a widow and the Earl of Netherfield was no small statement. Imogen looked up into the acquaintance of his penetrating grey eyes, the faintest arch of a brow tracing the edge of her confidence. Her voice came steady, tempered with an undercurrent of unspoken acknowledgment. "I thought you might ask." Their hands met, his strong, certain and unyielding, hers light with restrained poise, and together they moved into the measured rhythm of the dance. The orchestra's violin sang sweetly, winding up a melody as delicate and tension-filled as the electric current threading between them. With every measured step, every turn beneath the whispering glow of crystal chandeliers, their silent conversation unfolded through glances and slight smiles. The Earl's eyes searched hers, seeking and silently confirming the guarded thrill that neither dared voice aloud in such a public arena. Imogen, in turn, offered no reply, save the language of minute shifts, an almost imperceptible lift of her chin, a quirk of lips holding back laughter or confession. Around them, the murmur of assembled spectators faded, replaced by the focused intimacy of shared space and stolen moments. They danced, not as rivals, nor as a widow and an earl bound by circumstance, but as two irrevocably drawn souls, risking quiet defiance for the simple truth of connection. As the final notes of the waltz sang into the hush of the assembled crowd, the Earl guided Imogen back to firm footing, his hand lingering an imperceptible moment longer at her waist, before dropping away with a reluctant ease. "Imogen," he whispered, voice low enough to pass between them alone. "You wear confidence better than any jewel tonight." Her answer was a soft smile that did not quite reach the depths of her eyes. "And you, my lord, carry restraint with difficulty." Their brief exchange was lost to the wider throng of onlookers, but the charged spark between them blossomed full and bright, a secret promise whispered silently beneath the chandelier's glare. In that moment, the gulf carved by years of rivalry and suspicion seemed to narrow, the undoubted tension between them knitting into something more fragile and yet far more profound. The ball wore on, but within the endless whirl of gowns and powdered faces, of clinking glass and murmured intrigues, a new narrative began to unfold, a tale spun in glances and guarded touches, one that dared to speak of possibilities beyond whispered scandal and the heavy chains of expectation. Imogen stood a little taller, heart thudding with fierceness and hope alike. The season had shifted beneath their feet, the dance between the widow and the Earl, drawing them closer, not simply across a ballroom floor, but toward a future neither yet dared name aloud. Though the eyes of London watched still, their story, silent and defiant, had begun its quiet revolution beneath the glittering stars. The moment the letter arrived, Imogen sensed the weight it carried before she even broke the wax seal. The creamy paper, folded with a ruthless precision and bearing a handwriting both familiar and venomous, trembled slightly in her gloved hand. She had hoped the night's fragile promise, the quiet revolution born beneath the chandeliers, could hold fast against the tidal undercurrents of London's gossip, but this missive tore through the delicate veil like a blade. She withdrew to the solitude of her chamber, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that seemed to shut out the murmured insinuations already drifting through the hallways. The flickering candlelight cast shadows that danced over the delicate script as her eyes moved with chilling clarity across words sharpened by jealousy and malice. To see the Earl's widow in such favour, what deep designs does she nurse? Vulgar ambition cloaked in widow's weeds, her eyes roving for title, her heart puppeteered by gold and gossip. Asterisk lines darted like poisoned arrows, accusing her of courting the Earl's attentions, not from affection or respect, but from sordid motives, words that mocked the stillness and dignity she fought so hard to maintain. Each phrase burned against her nerves like bitter brandy, searing and relentless, a public trial made private by the cruel hand of an enemy who concealed themselves behind innuendo and ink. Imogen folded the letter with deliberate care, smoothing its edges as though sealing away the harsh venom it contained. The scar on her left hand, a faint mark she seldom spoke of, itched with old pain, a reminder that suffering was never far behind her composed surface. Yet in this moment she refused to succumb to the flood of whispered scandal that threatened her resolve. She would not grant them the spectacle they so desperately sought. At dinner that evening, the salon buzzed with a strained undercurrent that only a handful dared to voice. Poking with the dull curiosity of society's less delicate scalpel hands, steered the conversation toward her casual inquiries masquerading as polite interest, but cloaked with sharp edges. Miss Imogen, a voice hesitated behind a fan, a tone laced faintly with accusation disguised as concern. There have been talks, unfortunate ones, I fear, about the nature of your recent associations. One cannot help but wonder if the Earl's attentions are as innocent as they seem. The words rippled through the table, a sudden chill that prickled the skin beneath her gown. Eyes sought to corner her, to unravel the thread of her carefully constructed innocence, but Imogen answered only with the most graceful stillness, lips pressing into a faint, knowing smile. She met their gazes with such composed serenity that the whispers faltered, as if confronted by a wall too solid to scale. "I assure you," she said, voice steady and clear, "that my acquaintance with the Earl is founded on mutual respect and nothing more. I am quite capable of defending my reputation without recourse to idle gossip." Madame Lettice, discreetly stationed at her side, gave a subtle nod of approval, a chaperone's guard, lifted yet firmly in place. Throughout the evening, Imogen's silence on the matter was not a surrender, but a declaration, a refusal to feed the hungry mouths of controversy. Yet privately, as the last candle guttered and her chamber embraced the quiet, Imogen's thoughts churned beneath the calm surface. How many times had she been forced to draw upon reserves of strength she scarcely felt? How much longer could she guard her heart from the sharp tongues of society without bearing some fracture of solitude deep within? Across the bright evening, where joy mingled uneasily with suspicion, her resolve held firm, but it was not immune to the cold bite of loneliness that crept in after the lights dimmed. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. A gathering of noble families, cloaked in embroidered silks and starched lace, danced beneath the lantern glow of the sprawling gardens. The very moments where the scandal-infused whispers might have thrived passed into silence, swept away by the Earl's voice, public, resolute, and unwavering. He stood amidst the rustle of gossiping dames and eager gentlemen, a figure carved from the stateliest marble who dared to defy the tide of innuendo swelling against them all. His grey eyes struck through the murmur with a verdict that left no quarter for doubt. "Let the record show," he declared, voice loud enough to reach the farthest corner of the orchard, "that these calumnies about Lady Imogen's intentions are baseless and unworthy of the respect due either to her character or the dignity of this assembly." His glance found hers across the crowd, steady and uncompromising. "I would ask you all to remember that before casting stones cloaked in masquerade." The crowd's murmurs faltered, some out of shock, others eyes narrowing with reluctant acceptance. The beat of whispered contest dulled, overtaken by the weight of his public defence. As the stars kindled one by one across the evening sky, the moment passed, but the space between them remained filled, not just with relief, but a fragile, unspoken truth. It was not triumph, but an opening, a place where truth might finally root itself, where the walls of pride and pain could begin to crumble. Later, when the estate's candles burned low, and the last notes of the dance faded into the night, Imogen found the Earl wandering alone among the fragrant blooms in the shadowed garden. His broad shoulders carried the subtle tension of a man wrestling with unseen chains, and beneath that stern mask illuminated by the moonlight, the traces of vulnerability lay bare. "May I walk with you?" she asked quietly, her voice threading through the cool air like a thread of silver. He nodded, stepping aside from the path into the garden's quiet refuge, where rustling leaves whispered like confidants. The silence stretched between them, suffused with the scent of jasmine and the soft croon of nightbirds before he spoke, the hardness in his voice softened by doubt. "I am not the man I would wish to be," he confessed, a rare flicker of self-recrimination shading his tone. "You see only the calm exterior, Lady Imogen, but beneath lies a storm of fears and flaws I have long struggled to conceal." She looked at him then. The Earl, so commanding in the daylight, now a figure of unguarded truth beneath the stars. The crease of discontent that etched his brow spoke of battles fought in silence. Battles she had come to understand were not unlike her own. "And what fears trouble you?" she asked, her voice a gentle invitation rather than a challenge. "There are days," he began, his gaze drifting to the ivy that curled like whispered secrets along the garden walls, "when I wonder if my past, my weaknesses, will forever cast shadows over any measure of happiness I might claim. I fear not just the judgment of society, but the judgment of my own heart should I prove incapable, unworthy of the woman whom I am slowly coming to care for more than I dared admit." Imogen's breath caught the wild thrum of her own guarded yearnings, mirrored in his confession. Pride, that formidable fortress she had built with painstaking care, wavered now, its walls touched by the gentle hammer of fearless honesty. "None of us is without fault," she murmured, stepping closer into the faint moonlight that dappled the garden path. "I carry my own scars, visible and invisible. Yet here we stand, not as mere survivors of past wrongs, but as people who dare to hope. If you fear unworthiness, then let us cast it aside together, face it, and discard it as easily as the dead leaves that fall at our feet." The Earl turned to her then, the sheen of vulnerability fading into something softer, more resolute. His hand rose, tentative, brushing the edge of her sleeve, not quite reaching, yet heavy with promise. "Hope," he repeated, voice low and steadfast, "is the most dangerous companion for a man like me, but also the most necessary." Imogen allowed herself the briefest smile, one born not from certainty, but from a new-found courage to surrender the battles fought alone. She met his gaze squarely, the depths of hazel reflecting, the steady determination stirring within. "We need not be fearless, only honest. In that honesty, pride will not shatter us, it will set us free." They remained there, two silhouettes, outlined by moonlight, their breath mingling in the chilled night air, the silence between them no longer empty, but charged with the fragile electricity of burgeoning trust. The garden, once the silent stage of whispered scandals, now bore witness to a different narrative, one of shared fears laid bare, of walls crumbling, not in defeat, but in the quiet strength of fearless hearts. Imogen felt something long buried stir, a fragile hope that perhaps, in this season of rivalry and secrets, they might forge something neither convention nor envy, nor the sharp bite of past griefs could ever undo. And beneath the vast canopy of stars, the slow dance of two guarded souls began anew, not on the ballroom floor, but in the tender shadows of midnight. The Earl finally spoke a whisper, meant only for her, words that promised neither certainty nor answer, but a beginning. "Walk with me, Lady Imogen. Let us face whatever dawn may bring together." And in the quiet embrace of a reluctant knight, she took his arm, a gesture unspoken yet profound, the irrevocable start of something dangerously precious and wholly their own. Imogen's fingers lingered on the cool metal of the wrought iron gate as the Earl's arm remained a steady anchor beneath her own. The garden behind them was cloaked in deep shadows, the last flickers of moonlight catching the silver edges of the rosebuds, their scent faint but unmistakable in the night air. Every breath she drew felt both heavy and fragile, loaded with the unspoken promise of a future she had once forbidden herself to imagine. For years since Thomas's death, she had built a fortress around her heart, not of stone, but of iron-clad vows and a fierce sense of self-preservation. That had been her mantra, her shield against the cruel betrayal of hope and loss. But now, beneath the indigo canopy, embroidered with stars, the steady beat of the Earl's calm steadiness softened what was once absolute. His presence was no longer a challenge to be met, or a game of wit and rivalries. It was a quiet warmth that reached through the chill of her past sorrows, thawing frost that had long seemed permanent. The truth was, she had not expected to find anything like this kind of love. It was not a fairy tale scribbled in the margins of society's expectations. It was not the grand declarations, nor the reckless passion of young romances that fuel parlours and whispered coquettish giggles. This was something different, a gentle, unyielding strength that spoke in looks rather than loud words, in small, steady acts rather than sweeping gestures. The Earl's imperfections, his quiet brooding, the crease of discontent she glimpsed when he thought no one watched, made him more real, more attainable. Unlike the flawless masks of the dukes and lords she had observed from the sidelines, his humanity was an invitation rather than a demand. She thought bitterly of those who judged her for bringing scandal upon herself, simply because she dared to walk into his family's garden alone. But if she was to survive amidst the suffocating expectations of the ton, she would do so by rewriting the rules in her own hand. It was not about flouting society for the sake of rebellion. Rather, it was about finding the courage to define what honor and happiness meant for her, not as a widow shackled to a shadow past, but as a woman who might yet live again. Imogen's breath hitched. "I never thought I could feel this." Not again. Her voice, barely above a whisper, trembled with a vulnerability she scarcely recognized in herself. "And certainly not with one I considered my rival." The Earl squeezed her arm gently, a silent encouragement. "Nor did I. Yet here we are, discovering that the heart's terrain is never as fixed as we believe." She smiled softly, the familiar sharpness replaced by an openness that startled her. "Do you suppose society will understand? Will they permit a widow to step from the shadows and into a new light, without suspicion or scorn?" He looked toward the faint glimmer of dawn warming the horizon, his grey eyes catching hers with a quiet resolve. "They may not, but I intend to meet them on my terms, and I believe you will too." A part of Imogen, the embittered part, nearly pushed back, warning her not to embark on this perilous journey, but deeper still, a voice, small and insistent, whispered that none of the paths before her were without risk or pain. To live fully meant risking the fractures of old wounds. To love was to be brave. Her fingers tightened on the Earl's sleeve. "Then I choose this path. Not because it is easy, or because the world demands it, but because I will no longer live in fear." He turned to her, his gaze lingering with something tender, almost reverent. You honour me, Lady Imogen, more than you know. Two souls, no longer bound by rivalry or grief, but by the fragile threads of hope spun out against uncertainty. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Later that day, deep within the heavy oak-panelled study of his family's ancestral home, his fingers curved absent-mindedly around the tarnished silver seal of a letter recently delivered, the wax still unbroken. Outside, rain drummed softly against the leaded glass windows, a muted symphony to the storm of thoughts swirling within him. His steward, Mr. Langley, stood near the door, a look of steadfast attention on his lined face. He had long been the Earl's confidant in matters practical and personal, offering calm where pride often drove rashness. "I shall ask it plainly," the Earl began, voice low, weighted with a seriousness that brooked no dismissal. Of the vow she made to herself after her first husband's death, Mr. Langley inclined his head, eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "A vow to remain a widow, Your Grace. It will not be a small thing to ask of her to break it. That is why I have sent word to her guardians." The Earl's fingers tapped a slow rhythm on the desk. "I wish to formalize our intentions. I will ask for her hand in marriage." Langley's sharp eyes met his. "You are aware, my lord, that you tread on dangerous ground. She is no stranger to pain and loss, and the tongue will not be forgiving of a match so soon, especially between two families so long estranged." "Yes." The Earl exhaled deeply. "Still, I must believe that her courage is as resolute as mine. It takes great strength to admit the desire for happiness after grief. A quiet defiance that I respect beyond words." Langley stepped forward, lowering his voice with the gravity due a family secret. "And yet you have not spoken of the pride that sometimes blinds you, the impulsiveness that has wrought storms before calm." A shadow flickered behind the Earl's eyes, a crack in the otherwise unyielding mask. "I am no saint, Langley. There are moments when I have acted from pride alone, when I have let impulse guide my hand without regard for consequence. I fear those faults may yet threaten what I hope to build." The steward's expression softened, understanding tempered by years of service. "Then perhaps your greatest challenge will be mastering the man beneath the title, not just the needs of society." A rare vulnerability flickering through his usual austerity. "I imagined that was the one task I had long resigned myself never to conquer. Yet there is something about Lady Imogen. She inspires me to try." Langley's voice was measured but gentle. "Then you must be patient, my lord, for patience is a new kind of courage." The Earl's gaze drifted toward the window as the rain continued its cadence. "Patience and an honesty I promise to uphold, even when it is uncomfortable." He returned his eyes to the steward, voice steeled with resolve. "I will not waste this chance. No longer will I allow pride or bitterness to fence me in. I intend to love her honestly, however imperfectly, and to stand by her side against whatever storms may come." Mr. Langley inclined his head, a look of approval dawning. "Then you have my support, Your Grace. Simply remember, love does not demand perfection, it demands presence." The Earl's lips curved in a contained but heartfelt smile. "Presence a lesson I shall carry with me always." A profound silence settled between the two men, punctuated only by the soft patter of rain and the distant chiming of the hour. In that moment, the Earl seemed less a figure of discontent and rivalry, and more a man opening himself to a future he dared scarcely admit, one shaped not by grief or pride, but by the tender possibility of love's renewal. Imogen's chestnut hair caught the golden light of a lampshade, her delicate fingers brushing nervously at the scar along her left hand. "I confess," she said softly, eyes searching his, "that I am no less fearful of what is to come." To step into this alongside you means risking all that I thought I had safeguarded by my vow." The Earl stepped closer, lowering his voice to a gentle certainty. "Fear is not the absence of courage, but its companion. I would not ask you into a life less worthy of your bravery." Her smile came slowly, genuine and luminous, a fragile bearing of her soul. "Then I shall meet this challenge. For what value is a promise if it extinguishes hope?" His hand lightly grazed hers, the touch sending a ripple through her nerves. "We shall write new promises, Imogenones, not rooted in fear, but in trust and mutual respect. And should the world watch with disapproving eyes, it will be their burden, not ours." She took a steadying breath, the weight of uncertainty simmering with the fierce heat of possibility. "Then let me be brave enough to walk this path with you, my lord." The Earl's gaze softened, the crease of discontent melting into an expression of quiet joy. "And I shall be honored to walk beside you, come what may." The garden, once a silent witness to whispered scandal and guarded glances. The scent of blooming roses mingled with the night air, promising that even amidst shadows, new life might flourish. Imogen's heart beat in time with the Earl's, two rhythms merging in a slow, deliberate dance, a dance not of society's dictates, but of two souls bravely embracing the unknown. The grand hall was awash with the soft flicker of countless candles, their flames casting a gentle glow over the assemblage gathered beneath the sweeping crystal chandeliers. The hum of polite conversation, the delicate clatter of teacups, the occasional soft laugh, these blends formed the distinct symphony of a Regency public assembly. Yet amid the murmurs and the rustle of silk, Imogen felt a particular weight pressing around her, as if the air itself had grown perceptibly thicker. She moved with the careful grace of a woman who had long perfected the art of measured steps and measured words, aware that every glance, every whispered conjecture was poised like a blade. Still, she bore herself with a quiet dignity that forbade the scandal's venom from breaking her outward composure. As she navigated the hall, her eyes caught something, an unmistakably deliberate presence settling atop the small cluster of lacquered ebony chairs reserved for ladies of her acquaintance. The calling card rested there, pale as a swan's wing, upon the dark wood. Its edges were precisely trimmed, the paper of fine handmade quality, and embossed with a silver crest that none could fail to recognize, the Earl's unmistakable mark. She knew at once that it was his doing. No one else would have dared such a declaration in the public theatre of the season, where every gesture was dissected and catalogued with relentless scrutiny. Imogen's heart fluttered against her rib cage, a delicate thrum of surprise and hope. To receive his card was to be acknowledged publicly, a quiet but resolute statement against the tide of gossip and judgment. Yet, as several curious eyes fastened upon her, and, perhaps most importantly, upon the silent invitation now dangling in the air, she remained still. Her hand lifted in a subtle curtsy, the slightest dip of her head, an elegant acknowledgment of the invisible bond forged between them. No words followed, none were necessary. Her silence, pregnant with meaning, spoke of strength and acceptance, of a quiet rebellion against the unspoken cruelties of society. She felt the heat of many gazes burn like wildfire upon her back. Yet every gaze seemed to shift slightly, uncertainty replacing scorn, as if society itself hesitated before pronouncing judgment. The intimacy of the gesture, the calling card, the curtsy, the unspoken consent, wove a delicate bridge between Imogen and the Earl. It was a beacon and emblem of alliance, trust, and growing affection, quietly declaring their connection without a need for scandalous proclamations. Her eyes, deep hazel and steady as ever, searched the room with growing confidence. Somewhere, across the crowded chamber, she knew he was watching. The Earl's penetrating grey eyes met hers briefly, a flicker of triumph and tenderness, melting the usual stern line of his brow. In that instant, the gulf of rivalry and wariness between their houses seemed to narrow. Society's whispers carried on, but their melody was now touched by admiration rather than derision. She pressed her clammy hands lightly against the folds of her gown as she moved away, her pulse steadied by the knowledge they had taken the first unassailable step toward a future neither feared to imagine. This was no fleeting tryst, but a deliberate dance, choreographed with care and conviction, a dance that defied the rigid choreography of society itself. The final ball of the season arrived with all its customary splendor and expectation. The great ballroom was a whirl of color and music, the air thick with notes of violin and the cloying sweetness of orange blossoms and polished wood. Silk skirts swirled feverishly around polished marble floors, and the sharp scent of lavender and powder mingled with the underlying musk of finely brewed coffee and anticipation. For Imogen, however, the majesty of the event carried a weight of liberation as well as performance. She wore a gown of pale sapphire blue, the very hue of a calm sea before a tender dawn, its silk shimmering softly beneath the chandelier's glow. Her chestnut hair was wound in rings and locks that framed her subtly scarred hand as she lifted it with effortless grace. Tonight, she danced without restraint, or at least without the suffocating self-doubt that had shadowed her steps these many months. Her movements were no longer a guarded pretense, but a fluid expression of something far deeper, a happiness quietly claimed, a freedom rediscovered, and an affection nurtured behind closed doors but now burning with undeniable brightness beneath the gaze of society. As she pirouetted into the dance, her eyes found the Earl's across the crowd, his broad shoulders relaxed, a smile breaking through the line of his stoic profile. His admiration was unabashed, his gaze never faltering from her, as if the entire world had shrunk to a spotlight focused solely on her laughter and grace. The whispered conversations of the onlookers gradually lost their edge, softened by the evident warmth and respect flowing between the pair. What had once been scandalous was beginning to be seen as something precious and genuine. The Earl, ever the guardian of propriety yet now visibly softened by Imogen's strength and intelligence, held her hand with a confident tenderness, a promise made manifest in touch. They moved in seamless harmony, the music carrying them through the evening as if their souls had memorized the rhythm of each other's heartbeats. For the first time, Imogen felt the chains of her promise loosen, eased not by the weight of societal expectation, but by the quiet understanding that had grown between them, an understanding that fear no longer commanded their steps. Their turning dance became the night's unspoken declaration, a vivid contrast to the rigid facades maintained elsewhere in the assembly. With every measured step, Imogen grew bolder, her smile widening with the knowledge that this was her choosing, her life unfolding with a newfound courage she embraced fully. The Earl's presence was a shield as much as a blessing, and yet he never overshadowed her brilliance. Instead, he basked in it, every admiring glance affirming her worth to himself and to all who watched. When the music finally drew to a mellow close, the applause rippled through the ballroom, carrying with it a wave of fresh respect. The murmurs became lighter, the once ruthless gossip muted in favor of admiration. Imogen's heart lifted. This was more than a dance, more than a fleeting moment of joy. It was the turning of a tide. Later, under the cloak of a clear starlit sky, the rival family's garden bore witness once again to their secret meeting. The night air was crisp, cool enough to awaken every sense, yet soft enough to hold the scent of roses and earth, as if nature herself conspired to veil their closeness. The distant murmur of the waning season's celebrations was but a faint echo, leaving them in a sanctuary of shadow and light. Imogen arrived with the quiet elegance that had so often stirred the Earl's protective instincts, but now there was no need to conceal the depth of their bond. They stood side by side, beneath the arching branches of an ancient oak, leaves whispering above, as though sharing their secret. No words were exchanged, not because silence was lacking, but because the language of their gaze and touch conveyed all they felt. His fingers found hers in the soft darkness, their grip both tender and firm, an unspoken vow etched in the night's stillness. The scar on her left hand traced a path that seemed to mark both past wounds and future healing, a testament to the journey they had undertaken. Beneath the star's watchful eyes, neither needed to speak. Their affection and respect were the quiet eloquence that bound them. Imogen's breath caught as she felt the Earl's steady presence beside her, steady, strong, and unwavering. The promises made months ago found new strength in that moment, unbreakable in the face of whatever the future might hold. When at last they parted, it was with the gentlest of smiles and a soft whisper that carried the weight of all their hopes. "Together, then," he said, "we shall face the world, whatever it may say." She nodded, her lips curving into a smile both peaceful and fierce.
"Together."
With one last lingering look, they stepped back into the shadows, the garden falling silent around them, silent, but alive with the quiet promise of a love that neither time nor scandal could diminish. And with the changing of the seasons came a subtle yet undeniable transformation in the fabric of society's opinion. What had once been a whispered scandal blossomed into a widely accepted romance, tender and true, born not of impulsive passion, but of wit, restraint, and mutual respect. Imogen moved with a new lightness in the corridors of estates and ballrooms, her bearing refined not by the necessity of concealment, but by the self-assurance that comes from choosing love on her own terms. The scar that marked her hand was no longer a symbol of past pain alone, but a quiet emblem of endurance and the courage to embrace a future uncharted yet promising. The Earl, too, wore the changes plainly. His discontented crease softened, replaced by expressions of admiration and pride that no longer needed to be hidden. The sharp lines of his jaw relaxed in the company of friends and family, his eyes revealing a man shaped and softened by Imogen's intelligence and strength. He was no longer the stern adversary from rival estates, but a man transformed by a love that honored both their past struggles and their shared hopes. Together, they navigated the season's final events with a grace that disarmed gossip and revised expectations. Their union, once contested and questioned, now stood as a beacon of tempered passion and quiet rebellion against stale conventions. Society, ever changeable, had come around to recognize the gentle power of their connection, a love forged through dialogue, patience, and mutual